Hi, today we are moving on to part 3 of Gulliver's Travels. And in this part of the novel, Gulliver sets out on another expedition, this time to East Asia. And as he's sailing about, he and his crew are attacked by pirates. They're described as Japanese. And Gulliver is allowed to is freed basically from the ship and is given a canoe and some provisions. We're not exactly sure why. Probably because he's on good terms with the leader of the pirates, and he eventually finds land. And curiously, finds a floating island called Laputa. And in this slide right here, you can see a couple of illustrations of Laputa. On the left-hand side, you can see this island. It's kind of floating above some mapped areas that are below. And as the island floats around, it controls the dominions below. So in this part, there's a continued critique of colonialism and colonial control. On the right-hand side, there's a lovely illustration of Gulliver when he first identifies this strange floating island, and this is right before they toss down the ladder to him and allow him to come up into Laputa and into the strange scientific society that he discovers there. So, and I want you to know that this is the hardest part of the novel, and in fact, my dissertation advisor many years ago, who I TA'd for, often would leave this part of the novel out when she would teach this. But I wanted to include this because I think it furthers Swift's critique of colonialism and the way in which science and mathematics and the Royal Society, which I want to talk about, figure into the drive to control and to understand and dominate nature, which is ultimately, I think, a manifestation of England's colonial ambitions, right? We can't kind of separate those two things out, scientific pursuit and colonialism, and as they were sort of imagined and lived in England. They were really linked together. So this is an image of Sir Isaac Newton at the Royal Society. He's seated there in the chair in the foreground. And you probably heard the name Newton before. And Newton is, Sir Isaac Newton is somebody who was a physicist. He was a mathematician. He was an astronomer. In 1687, he described universal gravitation and the three laws of motion, right? And this dominated the scientific view of the physical universe for the next 3 centuries, totally transformed the landscape of scientific inquiry. And he also built the first practical reflecting telescope. And he developed a theory of color based on the observations that a prism decomposes white light into many colors that form the visible spectrum. In mathematics, he shares credit with Leibniz for the development of differential and integral calculus. Okay, this is me reading from a source here, but I wanted to kind of talk about Newton because in this part of Gulliver's Travels, Gulliver is critiquing mathematicians, scientists, and members of the Royal Society like Newton. And this is before the disciplines kind of became separate. Like now we have math and science and English, right? Like they're all separate disciplines. They're different departments on campus. Back in the later 17th and early 18th centuries, a lot of these disciplines were kind of overlapping and actually like together. Like science and literature were really tightly intertwined. And so the Royal Society was formed in 1666 by edict of King Charles II, and it became a place where the culture of experimentation happened, where there were attempts to devise a universal language and to discover the mysteries of nature, basically. And so in this part 3 of Gulliver's Travels, Swift really satirizes these natural philosophers, these men, it's a gendered male thing, as too absorbed by their objects of study. So on page 147, for instance, you'll find these court pages. They're called flappers, and they have to strike the king's mouth and ear to get his attention when Gulliver's talking to him, because the king is wrapped up in his own sort of thoughts about the universe and about what he thinks about, that he can't actually focus on the conversation with somebody in front of him. It's kind of like, your resident geeky professor who might get so into their research that they don't always respond to your emails, right? Would be kind of a similar analogy. On 151, right, Swift writes that these scientists, these natural philosophers, are so disturbed by their studies of the comets, because this was another thing they looked at. They were looking at comets in the sky, and they were trying to predict, when the comets would come and make contact with Earth, that they have no, quote, relish for the common pleasures or amusements of life, right? They're unkempt, right? Their appearance is really strange, and they just don't enjoy life. And this extends to sexual life, right? He talks about these natural philosophers, these men, as having wives who are unsatisfied, and they carry on with other men. Quote, "For the husband is always so wrapped in speculation that the mistress and lover may proceed to the greatest familiarities before his face." Right? So they're so wrapped up by their experiments that they don't even realize that their wives are having affairs right in front of them. So we also have a continued critique of colonialism and the cruelty that colonialism encapsulates. And I wanted to point out that Laputa is near Japan. So I think this is really urgent for us to take note of, because in other parts of the novel, right, in part 1, Gulliver comes to Lilliput when he's on a trip to Van Diemen's Land, which is near Tasmania, Australia. And then Brobdingnag is near South Africa. So these all represent different parts of the world, where English travelers and settlers are going and attempting to colonize or to extract goods from. So in this part of the novel, Gulliver is in the Far East. And in 158, I want to look at this passage to close. So Laputa hovers above lands, and the Laputans actually have the ability to control the people below. And so an example of this on page 158, let me find this here. No, where is it? 1 second. Here it is, 158. And this is describing, right, Gulliver is describing how this town, how Laputa as a floating island operates. So it says, if any town should engage in rebellion or mutiny, fall into violent factions, or refuse to pay the usual tribute, The king hath two methods of reducing them to obedience. The first and the mildest course, by keeping the island hovering over such a town and the lands about it, whereby he can deprive them of the benefit of the sun and the rain, and consequently afflict the inhabitants with dearth and diseases. And so, this is a real sort of kind of sci-fi moment, right? That the novel really, I think this is the most sci-fi oriented aspect of the novel, but it's ultimately symbolic of the way that England would control Ireland, right? By withholding goods and services and money, by choking, by like, extracting goods, taking away the food, right? And imposing its colonial rule over Ireland. And so this is kind of a sci-fi representation of that. And in this passage, you'll go on to read about a place called Lindalino, which fights back, and then ultimately Laputa is able to impose itself in like a really brutal way over the people of Lindalino. So the critique of colonialism continues. Also, on page 169, at this point in the narrative, Gulliver has arrived to Balnibari. So he comes down from the floating island, right, and is now on the sort of stable ground beneath him, and he wanders into these rooms where all of these bizarre experiments are taking place. The thing is that these experiments, these are the kinds of experiments that were held. They were often incredibly cruel, especially to animals and living and even human beings, right? A lot of disabled people, deaf people, blind people were subject to these really cruel experiments. There's this moment here where he witnesses experiments upon a dog. I've underlined that here, which leads to the dog's death, and the experimenter tries to revive the dog. And so again, what I want to just end on is that Swift's critique of colonialism here includes the same impulse, the same desire of England to penetrate and to control nature in the same way that they are seeking to penetrate and control these various lands around the globe. And now England, this is again 1726 when Gulliver's Travels is published. England does not become the colonial power that it becomes really until the 19th century, till the Victorian period, when it controls 25% of the landmass of the earth. But at this point in time, England is well on its way. And so even though this section of the novel is difficult, I just want to encourage you to work through it and to do your best. I think it ultimately resonates with us today, but we can still think about things like ethics and bioethics and what the limits of scientific knowledge might be as they pertain to ethics, right? So that's it for today. You're only reading through 174, and then for our next class, you're going to get to finally part 4, which is when Gulliver goes to Wynnumland and meets the horse people. And that is a great way to end this novel. So thanks for sticking with me. And again, for today, we're going to do the collaborative annotation. So two annotations and 2 responses to classmates. You have until Friday at noon, our new deadline. All right, take care. Bye.